On February 10, 1979, a man called the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Banning, California, to report a body off Highway 243 in the San Jacinto Mountains. He said he didn't know if it was a man or a woman. Deputies sent a unit to the highway, and in packed snow south of Poppet Flats Road, they found a 17-year-old girl who had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Evidence collected from the scene sat in storage for 45 years before anyone could match it to a name. Her name was Esther Gonzalez. She was 17 years old, the youngest of the Gonzalez siblings, and she lived with her parents in Beaumont, California. Beaumont and Banning sit next to each other in the San Gorgonio Pass, about 85 miles east of Los Angeles. And the pass is a narrow corridor of land between the San Bernardino Mountains to the north and the San Jacinto Mountains to the south. In 1979, the stretch between the two towns was still partly rural, with open land, citrus groves, and long stretches of road where you could walk for a while without seeing anyone. The population of both towns combined was under 20,000 people. Esther's older sister Elizabeth lived in Banning. Everyone called her Liz. The two of them were a year apart in age and had grown up close. They shared clothes, shared friends, and spent their childhoods moving through the same years at the same pace. Her older brother Eddie was part of the same tight-knit community and went to the local high school, where he knew most of the kids in the area by name. On February 9, 1979, Esther left her parents' house in Beaumont and started walking toward Liz's house in Banning. The two towns are close enough that walking between them on a clear February day was something a teenager would do without thinking twice. The route ran along roads she'd walked before, through neighborhoods and stretches of open land she recognized. She never made it to her sister's house. Somewhere along the route, a man intercepted her. He took her off the road and into the area near Highway 243, which runs south from Banning up into the San Jacinto Mountains toward a town called Idlewild. He sexually assaulted her and beat her to death. Then he left her body in packed snow on the shoulder of the highway, south of Poppet Flats Road, and drove away. February in the San Gorgonio Pass brings cold weather down from the mountains, and the pass sits at about 2,600 feet, and the peaks on either side rise to nearly 10,000. Snow collects in drifts along the shoulders of the mountain roads during the winter months. He left her in one of those drifts, not buried, not hidden, just left there on the shoulder of a highway that climbs into the mountains. Deputies drove out to the location the caller had described and found Esther. She was partially clothed, lying in snow on the shoulder of the highway. The scene showed clear signs of sexual assault and blunt force trauma. Investigators from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office processed the area carefully and collected biological evidence, including a semen sample from the victim's body. They documented everything they could find along the roadside and the surrounding area. They photographed the scene, and the position of the body and the tire tracks and footprints visible in the snow around the shoulder of the road. In 1979, there was no way to run that evidence against a database. DNA testing didn't exist yet. The national databases that now match crime scene evidence to offenders were still almost 2 decades away. But the investigators preserved what they found, sealed it into evidence storage at the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, and moved on to working the case with what they had. They canvassed the area around the highway and the stretch of road between Beaumont and Banning. They talked to people in both towns who might have seen Esther walking that afternoon or noticed an unfamiliar vehicle on the road. And they knocked on doors in the neighborhoods along her likely route and checked with residents who lived near the highway turnoff. They checked gas stations, stores, and businesses along the way and asked if anyone had seen a teenage girl walking alone on the afternoon of February 9th. They checked criminal records for anyone with a history of violence against women in the Riverside County area and ran background checks on names that came in from tips and interviews. They contacted the California Department of Justice to see if any similar attacks had been reported in other parts of the state. They looked at unsolved cases from neighboring counties to see if Esther's murder fit a pattern. Nothing connected. Nobody came forward as a witness. Nobody reported seeing Esther after she left her parents' house that afternoon. But the stretch of road between Beaumont and Banning was quiet enough in February that a man could pull over, force someone into a vehicle, and drive away without anyone noticing. The road had almost no traffic that time of year. The investigation produced a stack of interviews and tips, but no viable suspect. 5 days after the phone call, sheriff's investigators managed to identify the man who had reported finding the body. They traced the call back through phone records and matched it to a local resident. His name was Louis Randolph Williamson. Everyone in the area called him Randy. He had grown up in the San Gorgonio Pass and gone to the local high school around the same time as Eddie Gonzalez. In a small community where everybody recognized everybody else, Williamson was a familiar face. Yet he had no criminal record and no history of violence that investigators could find. Deputies tracked him down and asked him to come in for questioning. They wanted to know how he'd found the body, what he was doing on the mountain highway that morning, why he'd gone to that particular stretch of road, and why he'd sounded the way he did on the phone. The deputies who had taken his call had noted his tone as argumentative. Most people who call in a dead body sound shaken or frightened. Williamson had sounded impatient, like he was checking something off a list. He hadn't asked the dispatcher if the person was okay. He hadn't offered to stay at the scene or help direct officers to the location. He'd given them the location, pushed back on their questions, and hung up. Williamson answered their questions. He gave an account of why he'd been on Highway 243 and how he'd spotted the body in the snow. Then they asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed and sat down for the test. He passed it. Polygraphs measure physiological responses, and an examiner interprets them as truthful or deceptive. Courts don't admit them as evidence because they aren't reliable. A calm person can produce truthful readings while lying. A nervous person can produce deceptive readings while telling the truth. The test measures stress, not honesty. But in 1979, a past polygraph carried real weight in an investigation. If the examiner said the subject was being truthful, investigators typically moved on to the next name on the list. Williamson passed and investigators moved on. Yet the man who had called the sheriff's station to report the body was released and never questioned again. Every detective who looked at the case after that saw the same notation: polygraphed, cleared. The DNA collected from the crime scene could have connected or excluded him conclusively. But the technology to run that comparison didn't exist in 1979 and wouldn't for another decade. No other suspects emerged. No witnesses came forward. The evidence stayed sealed in the same containers the investigators had packed it into that February. The case stalled. The Gonzalez family had to absorb the murder of their youngest member without any answer to the most basic question. Esther was 17. She'd been walking to her sister's house on a February afternoon, a walk between two places she knew, on roads she'd traveled since she was a kid. She didn't have a car. She walked because that's what you did in a small community where the next town over was close enough to see from your front porch. Liz carried her sister's absence through every year that followed. They had grown up sharing the same house, the same friends, the same daily routine. They were close enough in age that they moved through the same stages at the same time. After February 9th, that closeness became the shape of the loss. The person who had occupied every corner of Liz's childhood was gone, and the question of who took her stayed open for decades. Eddie stayed in the area too. He knew most of the people in the community by name, including Randy Williamson. They had gone to the same high school, in a community the size of the San Gorgonio Pass, where everybody recognized everybody. Yet Williamson was someone Eddie would have seen around town his whole life. He had no reason to connect him to his sister's murder. Williamson had been released early in the investigation, and that fact never reached the family in any meaningful way. Eddie didn't know what the case file said about the man who called in the body. He just knew that nobody had ever been charged. The case went cold almost immediately after Williamson was released. The evidence sat in storage at the sheriff's office while the family waited for answers that never came. 1 year became 5, then 10, then 20. Liz and Eddie kept Esther's memory alive within the family through 4 decades of holidays and gatherings where the question of who killed their sister sat alongside them. The family did what families of unsolved homicide victims do. Yet they called the detective's office and asked if there was anything new. The answer was always the same. They hung up and waited some more. They watched the years pile up without a single development. Different detectives inherited the file over the decades as officers retired or transferred to other assignments. Each one read the original reports, saw the notation next to Williamson's name, reviewed the evidence inventory, and put the file back down. Nobody circled back to the man who had called in the body. The notation said he'd passed. In 1998, CODIS came online. The FBI's national DNA database allowed crime scene profiles to be run against millions of convicted offenders across the country. For unsolved cases with biological evidence in storage, it was a breakthrough that had been 2 decades in the making. And investigators submitted the evidence from Esther's case. No match came back. Williamson had no criminal record. He'd never been arrested for anything that required a DNA sample. His profile wasn't in the system. CODIS only catches people who've already been caught for something else, and Williamson had never been caught for anything. The years kept passing. Williamson left California at some point and moved to Broward County, Florida, on the southeastern coast. He wasn't running from an investigation. There was no warrant, no person of interest flag, no detective keeping tabs on him in any state. He had been released in 1979, and nobody had come looking for him since. He moved across the country, settled in South Florida, and built a life there. He lived and worked in Broward County for years, while the evidence from a frozen highway shoulder in California sat sealed in a storage room 2,500 miles away. He lived in Florida for decades. He was never arrested for anything in any state. He was never connected to any other crimes by law enforcement in either California or Florida. He grew old while the Gonzalez family back in the San Gorgonio Pass kept waiting for answers. In 2014, Williamson died in Florida. He was never charged, never questioned a second time after the day he sat for that test in February of 1979. During his autopsy in Broward County, a blood sample was collected as standard procedure. Autopsies routinely draw and preserve blood for toxicology and identification purposes. Yet the sample was stored by the Broward County Medical Examiner's Office in a refrigerator alongside thousands of other samples. Nobody in California knew the sample existed. Nobody in Florida knew it was connected to a 45-year-old murder in a mountain pass on the other side of the country. In 2023, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team decided to try something that hadn't been available for any of the previous 4 decades the case had been open. They sent evidence from Esther's case to Othram Inc., a forensic laboratory in Texas that specializes in advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. The evidence had been preserved since 1979, sealed in storage for 44 years. The original investigators who collected it on that highway shoulder had no way of knowing what it would eventually prove. They just knew to save everything. And in that decision is what kept the case alive. Othram scientists used advanced sequencing methods to extract and build a full DNA profile from the biological evidence. The sample was 44 years old, but it had been stored properly by the original investigators. The lab was able to pull enough genetic material to build a profile strong enough to search through ancestry databases. Genetic genealogy works on a different principle than CODIS. Instead of matching crime scene DNA against convicted offenders, it uploads the profile to public ancestry databases and looks for biological relatives of the unknown person. If anyone in those databases shares enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it means they're related to whoever left it. From there, investigators build a family tree using public records, tracing births, marriages, deaths, and addresses generation by generation until they can narrow the match down to a specific individual. Othram built the profile and returned it to law enforcement. The team ran it through a genealogical search, looking for relatives of the unknown male whose DNA had been preserved since 1979. The search returned matches. The matches pointed to a family. The family pointed to a name: Lewis Randolph Williamson. The man who had been questioned 5 days later passed the polygraph and walked out the door. The man who had moved to Florida and died a decade earlier. The team needed his actual DNA to confirm the genealogical match. Williamson had been dead for 9 years. In most genealogy cases, investigators collect a discarded coffee cup or a piece of trash to get the suspect's DNA. That wasn't possible here. But investigators learned that the blood sample from his 2014 autopsy still existed in Broward County, Florida. The medical examiner's office had stored it as routine procedure, with no idea it would ever be relevant to an unsolved murder in another state. Investigators in California coordinated with the Broward County Sheriff's Office across state lines. The request was unusual. A cold case team in Riverside County was asking a sheriff's office in South Florida to pull a decade-old autopsy sample from a medical examiner's refrigerator and ship it to a state crime lab on the other side of the country. The Florida agency located the stored sample in their records and shipped it to the California Department of Justice laboratory for comparison. While the DOJ lab tested Williamson's autopsy blood against the semen evidence recovered from Esther Gonzalez's body in 1979, it matched. Blood drawn in a Florida morgue in 2014 and evidence collected on a frozen highway shoulder in California in 1979 belonged to the same man. Two pieces of biological evidence from opposite ends of the country, separated by 35 years, confirmed what the test had hidden since the week after the murder. The man who had called the sheriff's station to report finding the body was the man who had put it there. He had reported his own crime, sat for a polygraph, passed it, and walked free for the rest of his life. A crime analyst assigned to the team said Williamson was seemingly cleared by the polygraph in 1979, but he was never cleared through DNA because the technology had not yet been developed. On November 20th, 2024, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team held a press conference at the sheriff's station in Banning and publicly identified Williamson as the man who killed Esther Gonzalez 45 years earlier. No charges were filed because he had been dead for a decade. There was no arrest, no trial, no sentence. The only thing the announcement could give the family was a name attached to what happened on that highway in February of 1979. Eddie Gonzalez learned that the man who killed his sister was someone he'd gone to school with, someone he would have passed in hallways and recognized on the street for years afterward. He said he was very surprised because he didn't think Williamson was capable of something like that. He also said he wished the guy had stayed alive long enough to serve his life sentence. But Liz Gonzalez wrote in an email that the family was very happy to finally have closure. After 45 years, the Gonzalez family knew the name of the man who had killed Esther. They knew he had been standing in front of investigators 5 days after the murder, and that a single test had sent the investigation in the wrong direction for the next 4 decades. They knew he had called the police himself to report finding the body he had left in the snow. Investigators asked the public for help. They put out a call asking anyone who knew Williamson or who might have information about other potential victims to contact investigators. Whether Williamson attacked or killed anyone else remains an open question that the team is still working to answer. Esther Gonzalez was 17 years old. She was walking to her sister's house on a February afternoon. Yet the man who killed her called the police the next morning to tell them where to find her body. If you enjoyed this case, go check out the other solved cases in the playlist.